January 17, 1943, Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany. The morning broke cold and colorless over the shipyards, the kind of winter dawn that turns breath into vapor and steel into ice. Dock workers moved like shadows through the mist, their boots crunching on frozen cobblestone, the tang of salt air mixing with coal smoke from the city's chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 7 times. The sound carried across the water, clear and sharp in the frigid air. No one looked up at the sky. Why would they? The Reich's Luftwaffe had assured them the homeland was impregnable, that the Americans with their gaudy machines and their factory-line thinking could never penetrate the fortified airspace of the fatherland. The war was something that happened elsewhere, in the steppes of Russia, in the deserts of North Africa, in the skies over Britain. Not here, never here. Then at 8 minutes past 11, the air itself seemed to tear open. They came from the northwest. 91 4-engine bombers flying in formation so tight, it looked like a single mechanical organism against the winter sky. The sound arrived before the sight, a low, thunderous drone that vibrated in the chest, that made window panes rattle in their frames, that caused pigeons to explode from rooftops in panicked clouds. The Boeing B-17 flying fortresses of the 8th Air Force had crossed the North Sea in broad daylight, without apology, without stealth, and now they hung above Wilhelmshaven like a judgment made manifest. Within minutes, the shipyards disappeared beneath a carpet of explosions. 500-pound bombs fell in mathematical precision, each detonation sending up columns of smoke and debris that merged into a single black thunderhead. When the formation turned west and vanished back across the water, they left behind a city transformed, not destroyed entirely, but marked, violated, forced to understand that geography was no longer protection. This was not supposed to happen, not according to the men who wore the iron crosses and oak leaf clusters, who had redrawn the map of Europe with their blitzkrieg tactics, who had studied warfare at the feet of Clausewitz and Moltke. The German High Command had looked at the American bomber program with something between amusement and contempt. Hermann Göring himself had publicly mocked the B-17, calling it a flying circus more suited to air shows than combat. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch had reviewed intelligence reports on American industrial capacity and dismissed them as propaganda, impossible exaggerations. How could a nation of jazz musicians and Hollywood actors, a nation that had spent the 1930s drowning in economic depression, suddenly produce weapons that challenged the technological supremacy of the Third Reich? The very idea seemed absurd, almost insulting, but Wilhelmshaven was real. The smoke was real. The bodies pulled from collapsed buildings were real. What the German generals had failed to understand, what their entire martial philosophy had not prepared them for, was that America fought wars differently. The Prussian military tradition valued elegance, the perfectly executed flanking maneuver, the decisive battle that broke an enemy's will, the surgical strike that demonstrated superior tactical thinking. War was an art form, a chess match played by great men whose genius shaped history. The Americans, by contrast, approached war like they approached everything else, as an engineering problem requiring industrial solutions. They built weapons the way Henry Ford built automobiles, on assembly lines where precision replaced artistry, where standardization replaced craft, where volume replaced virtuosity. The B-17 was not a masterpiece of aviation design. It was something more dangerous than that. It was a mass-produced instrument of airborne siege warfare, a machine that could be built by the hundreds, flown by crews trained in months rather than years, and sent into combat with the expectation that losses would be replaced before the month ended. The generals had scoffed because they were looking at the wrong thing. They saw a single bomber's specifications, its speed, its bomb load, its defensive armament, and compared it to their own aircraft. What they failed to see was the system behind the bomber, the continental-scale industrial infrastructure that could produce 50 B-17s per week, that could train thousands of air crews simultaneously, that could sustain a strategic bombing campaign through attrition rates that would have grounded any other air force in history. They failed to see that American abundance was itself a weapon, that the sheer material excess of the United States could be converted into military power on a scale that made traditional calculations of force obsolete. In the spring of 1942, when the first American bomber groups began arriving in England, Luftwaffe pilots had welcomed the prospect of combat with them. Finally, they thought, the Americans would learn what war truly meant. Finally, these newcomers with their pressed uniforms and their unscratched aircraft would face fighters flown by men who had survived 3 years of continuous aerial combat, who knew every trick of altitude and angle, who could kill with the economy of motion that comes only from experience. The early missions seemed to confirm this expectation. American bombers flying without fighter escort, venturing too deep into defended airspace, were torn apart by squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. On August 17, 1943, 60 bombers were lost in a single day during raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 600 men killed, wounded, or captured before sunset. The German pilots returned to their bases exhilarated, certain that they had taught the Americans a lesson about the costs of daylight strategic bombing. But the Americans did not stop coming. This was the first shock, the first crack in the certainty of German air superiority. Any rational military force having suffered such catastrophic losses would pause, reconsider, perhaps shift to night bombing like the British. The Americans simply replaced their losses and flew again, and again, and again. The bomber stream that appeared over Germany each week grew larger, not smaller. The formations flew higher, tighter, with discipline that turned individual aircraft into cells of a larger organism. When one bomber fell, the formation closed ranks and continued. When entire squadrons were decimated, new squadrons arrived from training bases in Texas and Kansas and Nebraska. The Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting an enemy that absorbed punishment beyond any logical breaking point, an enemy for whom losses were merely statistics to be managed rather than catastrophes to be avoided. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, a decorated fighter ace who had personally shot down 7 B-17s, wrote in his diary after a mission in October 1943, "Today I realized we are not fighting an air force. We are fighting a factory that produces airplanes faster than we can destroy them. Each time we engage them, we burn through ammunition and fuel we cannot replace. Each time they engage us, they lose aircraft they will replace within weeks. The mathematics of this war have become impossible. The mathematics. That was the heart of it. German pilots were still fighting as individuals, as knights of the air whose personal skill and courage could turn the tide of battle. But the Americans had industrialized aerial combat. They had reduced it to tonnage dropped, sortie rates maintained, target sets destroyed. The B-17 crews themselves were part of this machine, trained not as warriors but as technicians who operated complex equipment under fire. Each man had a specific job: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, flight engineer, ball turret gunner, waist gunner, tail gunner. Together, they formed a precision instrument. Individually, many were barely old enough to vote. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Michigan and nowhere towns in Oklahoma. Young men who had never left their home states before the war, who learned to fly bombers with less training time than it took to become a Luftwaffe fighter pilot. Yet they climbed into their aircraft day after day and flew into airspace defended by the most experienced air force in the world. And they did so with a calm professionalism that bordered on the mechanical. What sustained them was not martial glory or ideological fervor. It was something the German generals had not factored into their calculations: the absolute confidence that came from American abundance. Every B-17 crewman knew that behind him stood the full industrial might of a continent that produced more steel than the rest of the world combined, that built more aircraft engines in a year than Germany built in the entire war, that could afford to armor its bombers so heavily that they could absorb damage that would obliterate any other aircraft. The Flying Fortress earned its name honestly. 13 Browning M2 machine guns mounted in positions covering every approach angle, armor plating protecting vital crew positions, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits without exploding. These were not features included for elegance. They were the engineering solutions of a nation that could afford to add 2,000 pounds of defensive systems because it had the aluminum and the engines and the runways to handle the weight. The generals scoffed at this too. They called it wasteful, inefficient, typical of American excess. A properly designed bomber, they argued, should be fast enough and high enough to avoid interception. All this armor and armament was dead weight that reduced speed and ceiling, that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of aerial warfare. What they failed to grasp was that the Americans had run the calculations differently. They had determined that it was cheaper to add armor and guns than to train replacement crews. They had decided that mission success rates mattered more than maximum performance specifications. They had built a bomber that could be damaged, that expected to be damaged, and that would bring its crew home anyway. And increasingly, terrifyingly, the flying fortresses were bringing their crews home. By the winter of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were reporting encounters that defied their understanding of aerial combat. They would press an attack, rake a B-17 with cannon fire, see pieces of the aircraft's skin peel away, see smoke trail from an engine, and then watch in disbelief as the bomber maintained formation and continued toward its target. They shut off tail sections and the bombers flew on. They killed pilots and co-pilots took over. They set engines ablaze and flight engineers feathered the propellers and compensated with the remaining 3. There were reports of B-17s landing in England with holes large enough to crawl through, with entire sections of fuselage missing, with control surfaces shot away. One aircraft returned with its ball turret gunner dead and frozen in his shattered position, but the pilot had still completed the bomb run before turning for home. Another landed with more than 400 holes in its skin, with 2 engines destroyed with the tail gunner's oxygen system shot away so that he had nearly suffocated at 25,000 feet, but the bombs had been delivered to within 100 meters of the target. This was not courage in the traditional sense, not the martial valor that German military culture celebrated. This was something colder, more industrial, more American. It was the refusal to acknowledge that a mission could not be completed, the engineer's certainty that any problem could be solved with enough system redundancy. The B-17 was designed around this philosophy. It had 4 engines because 3 could bring it home. It had multiple gunners because if one was killed, others could cover his field of fire. It had a Norden bomb sight, a $15,000 mechanical computer that could calculate bomb trajectories factoring in altitude, airspeed, wind, and target movement. The entire aircraft was an embodiment of American technological optimism, the belief that sufficient resources properly organized could overcome any obstacle. And by 1944, the resources being organized were staggering beyond comprehension. The 8th Air Force alone was dropping more tonnage on Germany in a week than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain in a month during the Blitz. 1,000-plane raids became routine. American factories were producing 17,000 B-17s before the war ended, along with 12,000 B-24 Liberators, another heavy bomber with even greater range and payload. The assembly lines at Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, and Consolidated ran 24 hours a day. Women who had never worked outside the home before the war were riveting bomber fuselages together. Teenagers barely out of high school were wiring electrical systems. The entire civilian economy had been converted into a military production apparatus, and the output was biblical in scale. German generals began receiving intelligence reports that they refused to believe. American aircraft production estimates had to be recalculated, then recalculated again, then finally accepted as grimly accurate. The numbers were obscene. The Americans were building aircraft in quantities that exceeded the entire German production run of some fighter types. They were training pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could kill them. They were developing new tactics, new technologies, new systems with a speed that suggested unlimited research and development budgets, because that is precisely what they had. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, was designed, tested, and mass-produced in less time than it took Germany to bring some weapon systems from prototype to deployment. By early 1944, these fighters were appearing over Germany by the hundreds, and the equation of aerial combat shifted irrevocably. Now the Luftwaffe fighters that rose to intercept bomber formations found themselves fighting not just the bombers, but swarms of escorts that outperformed, outnumbered, and outlasted them. German pilots who survived the first pass often did not survive the second. Fuel shortages meant they could not train replacement pilots adequately. Oil shortages meant their synthetic fuel was of poor quality, reducing engine performance. Aluminum shortages meant they could not build enough aircraft. Every resource the German war machine needed was in increasingly short supply. While the Americans seemed to possess infinite reserves of everything, Oberst Johannes Trautloft, a fighter wing commander who had flown since the Spanish Civil War, wrote to his superiors in March 1944, "We are asked to perform miracles with dwindling resources against an enemy whose material advantage grows exponentially. Our pilots are brave, but bravery cannot overcome mathematics. We shoot down their bombers and more arrive. We train new pilots and they are killed before they gain experience. We receive new aircraft, but there is insufficient fuel to fly them. Meanwhile, the Americans improve their tactics, extend their range, and increase their numbers. I do not know how to win a war against an opponent who can afford to lose everything and still have more. The cities were vanishing. That was the unbearable truth that civilian and military leadership alike struggled to accept. Not vanishing in the sudden apocalypse of fire that British night bombers created, but disappearing methodically, target by target, in daylight raids where American bombardiers could actually see what they were hitting. The flying fortresses specialized in precision bombing, not precision by modern standards, but precision compared to the area bombing of night raids. They targeted ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, rail yards, submarine pens. They flew to specific addresses in specific cities and dropped high explosives from 25,000 feet with accuracy measured in hundreds of feet, rather than miles. The psychological impact was worse than the physical destruction. When the British bombed at night, Germans could tell themselves that the enemy was blinded by darkness, dropping bombs randomly in the general vicinity of urban areas. But when Americans bombed in daylight, when formation after formation flew overhead in perfect geometric arrays, when bombs fell in patterns clearly designed to obliterate specific industrial complexes, the message was unmistakable. You are not hidden. You are not safe. We can reach you whenever we choose, and we will return tomorrow. The sense of violation was profound. These were not raids of terror or revenge. These were acts of industrial assassination, the cold elimination of Germany's capacity to wage war. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, the roll call of devastation grew longer each month. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years acquired new geographies of rubble. Factories that had produced weapons for the Wehrmacht became skeletal frameworks of twisted steel. Rail networks that had supplied the Eastern Front became impassable tangles of destroyed track and collapsed bridges. The German economy, already strained by fighting on multiple fronts, began to fragment as critical nodes of production were systematically eliminated. And still, the generals had no answer. They tried massing fighters for overwhelming attacks on bomber formations, but the fuel costs were unsustainable. They tried developing jet aircraft that could outrun the escorts, but the jets arrived too late and in too few numbers. They tried dispersing factories to smaller sites hidden in forests and tunnels, but this decreased production efficiency. They tried everything their doctrine and experience suggested, and none of it mattered because they were fighting an enemy that operated according to different rules, that could absorb losses they could not, that replaced losses faster than they could inflict them. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially lost the battle for German airspace. American bombers flew over the Reich in formations of 500, 700, 1,000 aircraft, escorted by fighters that hunted down German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. The flying fortress had become what its designers intended, a strategic weapon platform that could project American industrial power deep into enemy territory, that could conduct a sustained campaign of aerial siege warfare, that could destroy the enemy's means of production faster than they could rebuild. The scoffing had stopped. The mockery had turned to silence, then to grim acknowledgement, then to something close to despair. There is a recording captured by Allied intelligence in late 1944 of a Luftwaffe briefing where a squadron commander addresses his pilots before a mission. His voice is tired, emptied of the confidence that characterized German military communications earlier in the war. "Gentlemen," he says, "you will encounter American heavy bombers in formation. You will be outnumbered. Your fuel will limit your engagement time to minutes. You will face escort fighters with superior performance. Your objective is to disrupt their bomb run if possible. I cannot promise you will return. Dismissed." This is what the war in the air had become for Germany. Not a contest of skill or courage, but a grinding attritional nightmare where every mission was essentially a suicide sortie, where survival was fortune rather than expectation. The symbolic power of the B-17 had eclipsed its technical capabilities. It had become, in the minds of both Germans and occupied Europeans, a representation of American power, not just military power, but the power of an entire economic system that could convert industrial abundance into strategic dominance. When formations of flying fortresses flew over France or Belgium or Holland in 1944, people came out of their homes to watch, to count them, to derive hope from their numbers. The bombers were visible proof that America had joined the fight with its full strength, that the enormous productive capacity of a continent-sized nation was now dedicated to the destruction of the Third Reich. For the occupied, the bombers were a promise. For the Germans, they were a sentence being executed in installments. The transformation in German military thinking was complete by the war's final year. The generals who had scoffed at American industrial warfare in 1942 were writing memoranda in 1945, analyzing how completely they had misunderstood the nature of modern war. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, in testimony after the war, admitted that German strategic planning had been premised on assumptions that proved catastrophically false. "We believed," he said, "that wars were still won by superior tactics, by better trained soldiers, by more advanced weapons. We did not understand that America had changed the fundamental equation. They proved that wars are won by production capacity, by logistical systems, by the ability to sustain operations indefinitely. We fought a 19th century war while they fought a 20th century war. We never had a chance." This was the ultimate scoff. The final mockery not of the Americans, but of themselves, of their own certainty, of their belief that Prussian military tradition and Germanic technical prowess would inevitably prevail. The Flying Fortress had taught them otherwise, had demonstrated through 10,000 missions and 200,000 tons of bombs that the future of warfare belonged not to warrior aristocracies, but to industrial democracies, not to nations that valued martial excellence, but to nations that valued production efficiency. The recurring symbol throughout this transformation was not a weapon or a tactic, but a simple, material fact: abundance. Every B-17 represented aluminum that Germany lacked, fuel that Germany could not produce, trained crews that Germany could not replace. Every mission demonstrated America's ability to expend resources on a scale that defied European understanding. The bombers carried this abundance into German airspace every day, made it visible, made it terrifying. German civilians who watched the formations pass overhead understood viscerally what their leadership had been slow to accept, that they were at war with a nation that could afford to fill the sky with 4-engine bombers, that had so much of everything that it could assign 13 machine guns to a single aircraft, that built planes so tough they could fly home with catastrophic damage. This abundance was inseparable from American democracy. The factories producing the bombers were not slave labor camps or coerced workforce. They were staffed by citizens who had chosen to take those jobs, who were paid competitive wages, who worked under union protections, who saw their contribution to the war as part of a shared democratic project. The pilots flying the missions were not fanatics or ideologues. They were ordinary young men from every state and every background, unified not by blood or soil, but by citizenship in a democratic republic that had been attacked and had chosen to respond. The entire strategic bombing campaign was an expression of democratic capitalism's capacity to organize massive collective efforts without resorting to totalitarian control. German military philosophy had no framework for understanding this. They knew how to fight nations led by warrior kings or revolutionary dictators. They did not know how to fight a nation where power flowed from broad-based consent, where military strategy was debated in newspapers, where production decisions were made by corporate managers rather than party officials. The diffuse, decentralized nature of American power made it impossible to decapitate, impossible to negotiate with, impossible to intimidate. There was no Führer to assassinate, no Politburo to negotiate with, only a vast, continental democracy that had decided through constitutional processes to mobilize its full strength. By April 1945, when the last B-17 combat missions were flown over Germany, the Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years was a burning ruin. The cities that had been centers of German civilization for centuries were heaps of rubble. The factories that had armed the Wehrmacht were smokestacks standing over empty foundations. The rail network was destroyed. The roads were cratered. The economy had collapsed. And overhead daily the bombers still came, now facing almost no resistance, delivering their payloads with the punctuality of mail carriers. The generals who survived the war had plenty of time in Allied prison camps to reflect on their miscalculations. Some wrote memoirs, some gave interviews, some collaborated with American military historians trying to understand what had happened, and almost all of them returned in one way or another to the same recognition. They had scoffed at the flying fortress because they did not understand that it was merely one component of a system they could not match, could not defeat, could not even comprehend until it had already destroyed them. They had looked at a bomber and seen a target. They should have looked at the bomber and seen behind it the factories, the mines, the oil fields, the farms, the universities, the political system, the entire architecture of American civilization reorganized for war. The B-17 was never just an aircraft. It was a messenger, carrying a declaration printed in high explosives, that the industrial age had created new kinds of power, that geography was no longer protection, that material abundance could be converted into strategic invincibility, that the 20th century would belong to nations that could mobilize not just armies, but entire economies. The generals scoffed because they were living in the past, worshipping at altars of tactical brilliance and martial valor that history was in the process of rendering obsolete. The future arrived over their cities at 25,000 feet, in formations of 100 bombers day after day after day, until the present they knew was rubble and the future they feared was reality. And when the silence finally came, when the last bombs had fallen and the last bomber had returned to base, what remained was a continent transformed by precision and abundance, not conquered in the traditional sense, but methodically dismantled, its capacity for war extracted with surgical efficiency. The cities had not vanished entirely. They had been edited, revised, reduced to their essential geographies with their industrial infrastructure excised. It was warfare as engineering, war as problem-solving, war as Americans understood it. In the end, the greatest casualty was not German military power but German certainty, the unshakable belief that Europe's warrior traditions, refined over centuries, represented the pinnacle of military thought. The flying fortress shattered that certainty, not through tactical genius but through persistent, unglamorous, overwhelming application of resources. It proved that in modern war, abundance matters more than elegance, that system redundancy matters more than individual brilliance, that sustainability matters more than perfection. These were not truths that German military culture valued or even recognized as truths. They were American truths, built into the DNA of a nation that had always solved problems by throwing resources at them, that had always believed more was better, that had converted that simple philosophy into a strategic doctrine without even realizing it. The sky over Germany, once defended by the world's finest air force, had been conquered not by better pilots but by better production schedules. The generals scoffed until they had nothing left to scoff at, until the evidence was so overwhelming that denial became impossible, until their cities had vanished beneath precision bombs and their Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel, and their 1,000-year Reich was a memory written in rubble. They learned too late that in the calculus of modern war, the nation that can afford to fill the sky with flying fortresses will triumph over the nation that can only afford to admire them.